Did you know that over 50% of animals suffer from obesity? That 50% of dogs over the age of 10 are dying from cancer? And that the incidence of heart disease, liver disease, and kidney disease is epidemic in our animals? And a major factor in that is food. My name is Dr. Michael Dym, and I'm a holistic veterinarian here in West Palm Beach, Florida. I offer in-person consultations to clients in the South Florida area, and I offer phone consultations nationwide. So today I want to touch on a little bit about aspects of proper and improper diets in our animals. Now, veterinarians get next to no training on nutrition in medical school. I believe we get about 2 hours of training our third year of medical school, and we're often brainwashed by pet food sales reps or doctors that are hired by the commercial pet food industry. And they brainwash us into saying that animals should be eating processed commercial foods from the time they're puppies to the time they get older. The pet food takes up the second most space, only to the cereal aisle in the grocery stores. It really is a multi-million-dollar industry. Now, what are in these commercial pet foods? Holistic practitioners often consider the 4Ds as the main ingredients, and those are dead, dying, diseased, and disabled animals that come from the rendering or meat processing plants and deemed inedible for human consumption. Roadkill and mill floor sweepings also find their way into pet food, as well as euthanized animals as well. Many, many years ago, there was a famous racehorse by the name of Ferdinand, who was a gelding that couldn't be used for breeding purposes in the thoroughbred industry. He was euthanized and ended up in a pet food can. Quite alarming, that's for sure. Other than the 4Ds, there are other starches and fillers in the pet foods. There are artificial colorings and preservatives, synthetic vitamins and minerals, meat byproducts, starches, fillers. They all find their way into the commercial pet food. There's a new one that's developed over recent years known as hydrolyzed protein diets. These synthetic diets were developed to help treat animals with chronic bowel issues or skin issues. And they're synthetically made in the lab where the proteins are broken down into very small molecules so that animals can't react to them, and thus reducing symptoms of bowel issues and skin issues. However, eating these synthetic diets over many months or years, in my experience, can lead to an incidence of chronic disease and cancer in our animals. So what are the options of feeding our animals? We have in commercial pet food industry, canned versus kibble food. Kibble is cooked and extruded to very high temperatures, and that often denatures the innate proteins and enzymes in the food. They're also extremely dry, obviously, and that's very dehydrating to animals that consume those foods day in and day out. Carbohydrate-rich kibbles are actually filled with fillers, and they actually cause weight gain and diabetes, as well as cardiovascular disease and inflammatory bowel disease and cancer, and are filled with cheaper binders and fillers. Now, when I'm counseling clients many years ago, actually, I used to counsel them on how to evaluate these foods. I told them to look at the ingredient list. And I told them that the first 2 out of 3 ingredients in a commercial pet food should be meats. However, the pet food industry has done something clever over recent years known as ingredient splitting. And that's where they break up a single carbohydrate into its components to list on the label to make it look like there are less concentration of these ingredients versus meat. And when you add these carbohydrates up, it actually far surpasses the amount of meat in these foods. This is seen with rice and corn and potatoes. Rice, for example, is broken down into whole ground rice, rice hulls. Corn, for example, is broken down into corn gluten meal, whole ground corn, and corn flour. Rice is often broken down into rice hulls and rice bran and ground brown rice, in addition to brewer's rice. And again, these are listed separately on the ingredient list and actually make it look like they're higher concentration than they actually are, actually lower concentration than they actually are. Now, there are several misconceptions about the commercial pet food industry and about kibble specifically. Many years ago, a fad developed in veterinary medicine known as grain-free diets. And these diets are hardly, carbohydrate or starch-free. They're also often processed, and feeding them has been shown recently to actually increase the incidence of certain cardiac diseases, especially in large breed dogs. Kibble is also considered a complete and balanced diet and is actually optimal, but these are far from optimal. They're actually made with minimal levels of nutrients just to survive, not to thrive. Many of the AFCO studies done on these diets were actually carried out over, unfortunately, only a certain number of weeks and in a small number of dogs. And they weren't found to be studied over many, many months or years so that we can see the effects on the health of animals fed these processed commercial foods. Kibble also doesn't clean teeth. That's another misnomer that many of my conventional colleagues tell their clients. Because they're rich in carbohydrates, the carbohydrate process of digestion starts in the mouth, where these are broken down into sugar molecules, increased incidence of tartar and gingivitis and plaque on the teeth. So exactly the opposite of what my colleagues are telling you. Feeding the same food daily is often recommended by my conventional colleagues. And I have many clients that say if they deviate from feeding the same food daily, then animals often get sick. These are actually animals that have unhealthy digestive tracts and need the services of a holistic veterinarian to strengthen digestion. Animals thrive on a variety. Feeding the same protein day in and day out limits nutrition and actually increases, again, the exact opposite, the incidence of chronic allergies and sensitivities, which lead to all sorts of health problems in the body. Kibble is also not better than canned. Many colleagues say animals should eat only kibble. But as we discussed in a previous talk, feeding kibble only to cats not only dehydrates them, but increases significantly the incidence of urinary tract disease. The incidence of bloat also is significantly increased in large breed dogs fed mainly kibble. Kibble is mostly loaded with corn. Corn is, again, another filler, and the ingredients of the corn fed that are actually in these foods are actually feed corn that is fed to cattle and cheap feed corn remnants. There are also GMOs, highly synthetic GMOs, fattening, and lead to obesity and diabetes in our animals. There are many actually options to feeding these processed toxic foods in our animals. And what are they? I actually recommend a species appropriate, fresh, rotating protein, raw meat diet. There are many thoughts on how we should do that. Dr. Ian Billinghurst, many decades ago, came up with what's known as the BARF manner of, and that contains high levels of meats, of course, organs, bones, as well as a small amount of vegetables. And I've seen animals thrive on the Ian Billinghurst BARF way of feeding. Dr. Richard Pitcairn, in the earlier editions of his book, Dr. Pitcairn's Guide to Natural Health for Dogs and Cats, he actually advocated more balanced diets, including meats, grains, and vegetables. Now, his argument in feeding those diets is actually that wild dogs and cats actually go for the stomach contents of their prey first before going for the muscle meat. And actually, the stomach contents of these animals is rich in grasses and grains. So that's the argument made for feeding a more balanced diet, like Pitcairn advocates. In his most recent edition, Dr. Pitcairn actually goes and recommends even vegetarian diets for dogs and even cats, which I don't feel can be made into vegetarians. His argument there is that the higher animals eat on the food chain, the higher their exposure to synthetic GMOs and pesticides and even heavy metals. And that can be problematic in small breeds of dogs and in cats. So his recommendation is to go more vegetarian now, as well as being ecologically friendly, as well as seeing how animals are raised in often very cruel situations. So he's advocating for all animals in his vegetarian recommendations. I, however, still recommend for carnivores the species-appropriate raw meat diet. Now, there are several sources you can get of a raw meat diet. There's an excellent company down here in South Florida known as My Paleo Pet, which I've been working with for many, many years. And the cattle there that are given in the meat supply actually are human grade, hormone-free, grass-fed animals that are extremely healthy for our companion animals. And they package those into small packets that they ship throughout the state of Florida and around the country. So I've had many clients be very satisfied with that way of feeding. There are also new companies now that now make raw protein diets into packets that they sell. These companies include companies like Honest Kitchen, Stella and Chewy's, and Primal. And these companies also are readily available now, their foods, in finer pet health food. And finally, there's the option of feeding what are known as freeze-dried or dehydrated diets, where you actually add water to them and they become a complete diet. Now, these, while they're better than commercial pet foods, are still a little bit more processed and not as ideal as feeding a fresh raw meat diet. Now, what are the benefits of feeding a fresh raw meat diet? You'll see animals with shinier coats, brighter eyes, less incidence of skin disease and allergy, better digestive tract function, and significantly less incidence of systemic diseases and even cancer. And as I said, as Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine and medicine thy food. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you again in the near future. My name is Dr. Michael Dym, and again, I'm a holistic veterinarian here in West Palm Beach, Florida. I welcome in-person consultations as well as phone consultations nationwide. Thank you very much.